Hello.
Hi. Zoom user. That seems suspicious. Do we still have Zoom bombers? Do they want to, would they want to bomb this meeting? Zoom. I'll never get used to this. All right. It's 6:30, but I'm still admitting some folks. So I know we're waiting for at least one board member. So welcome. Blank Zoom screens. Welcome. There's Marcia. All right, Rod, if you can, you're a co-host, so if you can sort of keep an eye on admitting folks, that would be really helpful while I have my screen up.
No problem.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna push the recording and start our meeting. There's Marcia.
Recording in progress.
All right. Welcome, friends and lovers of Norwich. It is Monday, February 14th, Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's Day. But alas, this is also a special select board meeting. This is a remote-only meeting. I am joined by Robert Gear, Marcia Calloway, and Claudette Brochu. Mary Layton is in service to her community at another meeting. So thank you, Mary. She can't be with us. And we're also joined by Town Manager Rod Francis. What we're going to do, Claudette Brochu and I are going to I'm going to share my screen. We're going to walk through a little bit of some information. There'll be about 20 minutes, and we'll take a break in between, and then also for questions, and then we'll also take questions at the end. So maybe I'll get started with sharing my screen without further ado. Okay, can folks see that? Okay, yes. Great. Let me just hold on, spotlight myself, and then I'm gonna spotlight Claudette. Okay. All right, so we'll get started. Okay, and I'll be reading, I have some notes that I'll be referring to. So as I said, welcome to the special meeting. We are pleased to take this time to provide information on this year's town budget and related monetary articles. We recognize that many of you may choose to vote absentee in advance and by mail. So we have striven to, or have strive to get information to you at the earliest. We have a brief slideshow, which you see here. The first half is on the FY23 operating budget, and the second, or the proposed operating budget, and the second half will be on articles. We'll take a break for questions in the middle, and then also take questions and public comment at the end. During this presentation, feel free to use the chat feature. The questions will go to the host and co-host. And please be respectful and courteous. If you think of any questions following the presentation, please feel free to write to us at selectboard@norwich.vermont.us. We have a meeting scheduled for February 23rd. And these presentation materials are on the main page of the website, along with related purpose statements and a version of this presentation as well. You may request your absentee ballot from the Secretary of State's website. Note that that will not include the Dresden ballot, and you may contact the town clerk's office directly. Bonnie may very well refer you to a form from our website she will instruct you to print and send. She can't take any authorizations by phone or email. In-person voting will take place on March 1st at Tracy Hall. And of course, our formal moderated informational session, more of what we are used to and love, will take place on February 28th via the Zoom platform, and we'll be joined by the school boards there.
So, as Roger said, this presentation is divided into two parts. We'll first talk about the fiscal year 23 budget, our goals for the budget, which were fairly straightforward, and also share some charts with historical information. So keep in mind that the fiscal year 23 budget covers the period from July 1, 2022 through June 30th, 2023. We're going to share information on the establishment of the Unanticipated and Emergency Expense Reserve Fund, the establishment of the Emerald Ash Borer Response Reserve Fund, the establishment of the Operational Performance and Development Reserve Fund, and our funding sources for the Operational Performance and Development Reserve Fund. Say that 5 times fast. So the operating budget is Article 4 on the warrant. It asks the voters to approve a gross spending general town budget of $4,958,865, plus state and federal grants and gifts consistent with the budgeted programs for the period July 1, 2022 through June 30th, 2023.
The board advised staff in November at the start of budget preparations to establish a level service operating budget. The proposed FY23 budget before you, the voters, reflects a commitment to maintaining current services while making best efforts to account for high inflation rates and other outcomes of the COVID pandemic. Level service operating budget, I should say, means that the services that you have now, you should expect to continue as proposed in the budget. This budget was capably and intelligently overseen by our now town manager, Rod Francis, and Fielding Asensa, our new finance director. We benefited incredibly from having a finance director in particular to assist in this budget process. And thanks to them and all of our department heads for their work in helping the board establish its goals towards a level service budget in a uniquely challenging year, and what I expect will be perhaps another one, but hopefully not. With all that said, the FY22-23 operating budget has a proposed increase of 3.72% from the previous fiscal year.
So in our proposed budget, operations represent a 3.72% increase, and allocations to reserve funds represent a 7.76% decrease compared to fiscal year 22. When we did decrease allocations in the reserve funds for records restoration, general administration equipment, fire equipment, sidewalks, paving, and bridges, while we increased allocations to the reappraisal fund, police department cruiser fund, fire department apparatus fund, and the generator funds. These were calculated decisions, but resulted in a decrease of 7.76% in our reserve fund allocations. Assuming that other monetary articles for social service agencies were to pass, voters will be considering a budget of $5,375,473, or a 3.85% total increase over the current year's level. This chart just shows the town's expenses over time, broken down into operations, reserve fund allocations, debt service, and articles. Our debt service covers the tower bond and interest, public safety facility bond and interest, the Trails Bridge principal and interest, and the safety facility highway garage overage and interest. And our first payment for the Trails Bridge actually started July of 2021. Our town maintains 45 reserve funds that set aside money for stated purposes. Examples of reserve funds include funds for highway equipment, townwide reappraisals, and more. Reserve funds are established by the voters. And once established by the voters, the money in a reserve fund may be expended by the select board for its stated purpose. Any money not spent in a reserve fund carries over and collects interest.
Historically in Norwich, I should say that we have referred to these as designated funds, but we are now following the terminology and statute to reduce any confusion about how these funds are structured or operated. Sorry, Claudette.
This is a chart just showing our reserve fund allocations over time. The big spike in 2012, 2013 covered allocations for the facilities study, records restoration, police department special equipment fund, and the communications tower fund. Those were things that were not previously included. The drop in 2019, 2020, 21 was all in response to the 2017 flood event, where we opted to be very conservative in allocating additional money to designated funds based on the impact it would have on the budget. So reserve funds can be the main form for financing for capital projects. Last month, the board approved a 5-year capital improvement plan. Not last month. Yeah, last month, January.
Yeah.
Seems so long ago.
Yeah.
The capital improvement plan will be refined each year to ensure that all associated capital assets and their costs are properly budgeted. We intend to look closely at our designated fund allocations as part of this work. During upcoming budget cycles, especially as we continue to work on the CIP, and especially as we have new department directors, we should expect to see changes in reserve fund allocations.
We know it's important for people to see the possible tax rate implications. These numbers are estimated only. There are a variety of factors that determine tax rate outside of increases or decreases to a budget. For example, these numbers are informed by last year's grand list, right, which is lodged after town meeting day in April, and ultimately the final tax rate is set in July.
So going into any budget season, the overarching goal of the board is to try to avoid significant increases in the tax rate. However, some increases should be expected, in part due to cost of living increases and step and grade increases for our employees. This year, we also had to acknowledge and budget for inflation. For the continued stabilization of the tax rate, the select board will continue to work with the town manager, finance director, and our department managers to understand the relationship between operating budget, reserve fund balances, level of debt service, and capital budgeting.
We also recognize that we are just part of the taxpayers' obligations. We are mindful of our budgeting within wider conversations. And so this chart just includes combined town and article costs alongside the budgets of Marion Cross, Dresden, and their totals. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing so I can, oh my God, here we go. All right, and now get back to Zoom. All right. So does anyone have any, are there any questions about the FY23 proposed budget? Linda Gray, I see your hand. Is that Linda Gray? Yes. Hi.
Sorry, it took me a bit to get the video and mute fixed up. I just want to wrap my head around the reserve fund stuff. And so here's this basic question. Is it, would you all characterize the change as mostly to bring what the town of Norwich does in line with state statute? Like, because it's not new money, it's just moving the money into a different place and calling it something else, right? And then is there different authority over it, or is it pretty much just a name change?
So for this part of the thank you, Linda, for your question. So we'll get into a specific article that I think addresses some of your other questions in the second half of the presentation. But for this part of the presentation, I think you should note that we have 45 reserve funds. They were previously called designated funds, sort of colloquially in Norwich, and they were designated or reserved for stated purposes that the voters establish and that the board expends from. And so that is, I think that is what's important to keep in mind for part one, if that's okay, if you stick around for part two. Does that make sense? Okay, but thank you. Anything that board members would like to add about what's important to note thus far about reserve funds? Okay, I think we're good. Any other questions on the first half of the presentation, the FY23 budget? I see. Could you please address what you have factors regarding inflation? I'm going to actually have our town manager discuss the factors for inflation. As I mentioned, he and, if that's okay, Rod, to put you on the spot, he and Fielding work closely on this for the board. I think I should cue him up by saying we've actually effectively reduced the budget. It's been pointed out to us because the increase is less than the rate of inflation right now. What are some of the inflation factors that were used for determining this budget, Rod? Can you thank you?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So in general, what we did was we looked at the Department of Labor's Northeast inflation figures, which are basically the COLA figures that are tracked and reported on every month, and then looked at what we then thought were reasonable predictions for the FY23 year for the operating budget. So that would be July 1, 2022 through June 30th, 2023. And also paid attention to, if you like, I think the economist term is a basket of goods that is somewhat different from the household basket of goods. So as a town, if you think of us as a business, we have exposure to some commodities and products more than others. So we use a lot of labor and we use a lot of fuel to do what we do, partly to do with the age and the condition of Tracy Hall and its consumption of fuel oil and running the DPW fleet. So as you can tell from your own experience, probably if you're buying gasoline or fuel oil for your own needs, you've observed quite dramatic price increases. We're not immune to that. And so we added some additional, we factored in a slightly higher than the predicted level of inflation for those commodities on the basis of tracking those prices. And we hope, of course, like many other people do, that the inflation stops even before, or at least slows before we get to the opening of the FY23 budget. But the jury is out on how well it's working. So I hope that answers your question.
I think, and that question was from Nan Carroll. Thank you for that question. And I will
Thanks,
say,
Nan.
the only thing I will add too is while we budgeted for these commodities and their likely increases, it was able to be compensated for other activities, particularly in DPW. And I'll have Ron address this, there was less predicted activity for the year ahead because we didn't have the full benefit of having a finance director to endeavor to discover what new projects we might be taking on. We were focused on finishing. So if you were wondering how people were budgeting for current projects, not new projects, while also increased pressures from commodities. Okay.
Roger, I think you meant to say DPW director, not finance director.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have just recently hired a new DPW director, but the expectation is that we'll be focusing on internal organization matters and finishing the projects that are on our books right now, rather than taking on a large slate of new projects.
That's great. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for that. Any other questions? All right, so we'll dive into the articles. All right, let me get my screen up here. Okay.
So Article 7 asks the voters to approve the formation of an unanticipated expenses and emergency reserve fund, initially funded through a transfer of $750,000 from the fiscal year 2022 unrestricted fund balance, and to be maintained in subsequent years at a level between 12 and 16% of the annual operating budget, through transfer of any fund balance that may remain in the general fund from the prior year's operating budget as approved by the Select Board, and or allocations in the proposed operating budget as approved by the voters. The transfer of $750,000 from the unrestricted fund balance is a surplus in the general fund from monies not spent over previous year's operating budgets. And this 12 to 16% actually equates to about approximately 2 months of operating costs.
Great. As Claudia mentioned, the $750,000 balance is part of a general fund, is part of the general fund and is unspent surplus from previous year's operating budgets. The board's current practice and policy has been to maintain these monies as an emergency fund balance within the town's general fund. So you see here the emergency fund balance is sort of the blue, right, within the general fund. Through our policy work this past year, we learned that to meet full compliance with statute, such a balance should be kept in a separate reserve fund. The board is asking the voters to establish a separate unanticipated expenses and emergency reserve fund and to approve its purpose. So here, just really quickly, you have the monies in an undesignated way, right? This balance is existing in the general fund and governed by a master financial policy that the board has written. In our policy work and through consultation with legal counsel, it should be governed by statute. So what we're proposing for the voters to approve is that the money does not exist in the general fund, but rather exists separately in a voter-approved reserve fund, and it will be sort of one of the reserve funds, but arguably a very important fund. And so what would happen is if you have a surplus of over 16%, we would look to make a proposal through the mechanisms of town meeting as to what to do with that surplus, whether it be to give it back to the voters through the approval of the operating budget that year, or to do it in another way to meet the goals. And if we were under 12%, we would look to raise money through taxes, right? So right now we're asking you to establish in a separate reserve fund, a 12 to 16 emergency fund, emergency reserve fund, right? And then anything that's over 16%, we will ask voters for, okay? I think that's, and we'll come back to it, and I'm gonna have Rod and Marcia and Rob and all board members find ways to say it in a different way, okay? The purpose statement is to fund operations by providing sufficient working capital for adequate cash flow, help defray the cost of borrowing or financial impacts caused by economic downturns, shortfalls of revenues, the imposition of additional costs by other governmental agencies, including courts, cutbacks and distributions from state or federal government, natural disasters, and other unforeseen circumstances. Okay.
So Article 8 asks the voters to approve the establishment of an operational performance and development fund to be governed by the purpose statement provided in the town report, and we'll show you that in just a second, to be initially funded through a transfer of $110,000 from the fiscal year 2022 unrestricted fund balance. Okay. The Operational Performance and Development Fund will support reviews of town operations, technical studies, and meeting grant match obligations as needed. Currently, if the town wants to undertake any study that may be proposed during a budget year, our options are limited. We can either pull funds from existing line items within the controls of our financial policies, hope a grant can be identified to cover the study, or defer the study until we can raise the funds at next town meeting. We recognize that studies with the purpose of reviewing town operations to improve efficiency or our environmental performance are not easily supported by outside grant sources, but are still very important. So for the first year of this reserve fund, the board intends to finance a 4 to 6 month review of policing and community safety, and to review the Beaver Meadow sidewalk proposal more broadly. These studies will not be impacting the fiscal year 23 budget or the fiscal year 23 tax rate, as their financing will be coming from what was previously called the unrestricted fund balance. We're placing these studies as articles on the warrant because we're signaling to you, the voters, our intentions with this first year of operational performance fund. Expenditures from reserve funds will normally be up to the select board to determine, but we wanted you to see what our initial plans were for these funds. In the future, the board may choose to make regular allocations to this fund and to consider other routine or special review of town operations with these funds. And Article 9 is the police and public safety study. So in August, the board authored a request for proposals for consulting services on policing and community safety in order to better understand what type of public safety services are desired by the community. The board relied on active and thoughtful community members to bring sensitivity and commitment to board discussions leading up to the release of the RFP. We received 2 bids. Bid 1 requires 4 months to produce a set of recommendations for police procedures and policies informed by recent trends in policing reform. Bid 2 requires 6 months and will create and train a task force in an open-ended approach to reimagine public safety more broadly.
The extensive materials on each of the particulars of the bid are in the December 22nd packet. Article 10, Beaver Meadow Road, Main Street to Moore Lane will be placed in the broader context in a master plan for bike and pedestrian facilities with particular focus on the village area. Planning may focus on traffic safety, site control for right-of-way, number of road crossings, and other matters identified in a recently completed phase 1 study. Long-range planning will allow town staff to more accurately identify scope, cost of construction, and priorities within other sidewalks and bike ped goals. Another way to explain this is that this is originally the grant was understood by board members to be constructed in 3 distinct phases. It turns out we have realized that phase 2 was not independent of phase 3, which required construction. So this essentially asks us to take up what phase 2 would normally, what would have happened in phase 2, but then also seeks a broader context with bike ped more broadly as defined in an action item in the town plan. Article 11 asks voters to approve the establishment of an Emerald Ash Borer Response Fund. It will be funded in new allocation and also with funds from reserve funds that have not been in use for several years. So you see here that Article 13 and Article 14 is asking approval of transfers from other reserve funds. They're not closing these reserve funds, but they are effectively zeroing out these reserve funds that have not been used. The purpose statement for this reserve fund is to support the mapping and response to emerald ash borer infected trees in the town of Norwich. The Conservation Commission has done important work in mapping existing ash trees along roadways, in particular to prepare for the arrival of the emerald ash borer. We anticipate additional mapping needs and related preparatory responses to begin to tackle EAB.
So this is a quote from UVM Extension Service describing what the emerald ash borer is. It's an invasive insect that attacks and kills 99% of all 3 species of ash trees found in Vermont. The emerald ash borer has been found in Hartford, Thetford, and other neighboring towns. Although not specifically identified as being in Norwich, the assumption can be made that that the bug is here. And as Roger mentioned, the Conservation Commission has begun work on mapping the ash trees along just the major roadways in town. And as you can see from this map, we have a lot of ash trees. Although infected trees may take years to show the impact of infestation, and there may be some trees that may survive the infestation, most of the trees will die. While we hope that the state provides funds for guidance, the town needs to develop a plan on how we will respond to the emerald ash borer. The options are limited and the cost is significant. So the establishment of this fund will at least get us started.
Okay, as I had mentioned, if anyone thinks of any questions at all, please feel free to write us. We have one more meeting where we will be able to take this up and then get back to you all. As I said, there's a version of this presentation posted online. You can find this, the purpose statements, an example of the warrant, the warrant, an example of how to vote for a warrant. All of it is on the main page of the website. And we're here for as long as we need to be to answer your questions. And I'm seeing that I have some already. And as I said, Article 7 in particular, I understand that people want to learn more, and we have, we spent some time thinking about it and planning for it. So you'll hear from a bunch of us, I think. I think you meant you think about returning the excess funds to the taxpayers, not the voters. Yes. Thank you, Nan Carroll, for the distinction. Linda Gray, is this year's town report available online? When will the town report be available online, Rod? Do you know?
Oh, yes, I do. Hello. We expect it back from the printer later this week, and it shall be most likely be available formatted and ready to go, I believe Thursday from the town website. So.
Okay. Any other question? Are there any folks who are confused by Article 7? This is an intimate enough group, and so we're pleased to bring back up the slides, have a different person explain it, right? Whatever is needed. Okay, Linda Gray, thank you.
Thank you. So I just want to ask again my first question, which is like, if I understand it, the money has been sitting in the
General
I'm
fund.
not sure, general fund, thank you. And then it's just going to be moved. So this is kind of an administrative thing. You're just moving it into a thing statutorily called a reserve fund, and you will do the same things with it there as you would if it stayed where it is now. Is that correct? Like, you want to maintain it at a certain level. So now, instead of being a portion of a big thing, it's the same thing but moved to its own separate fund.
It'll be moved with voter authorization, because voters have to establish funds with purpose statements. Otherwise, it would be governed by our financial policies, which the board write, and I might say can change, right? Boards write policies, boards modify policies. And so while we have, in the time that I've been on the board, and I think these folks have been on the board, there's been a consistent understanding about what what those undesignated funds are used for, that may or may not have always been consistent across the ages. Right. And so we want to make sure that we are compliant with statute. This isn't in response to anything that the town has done wrong. This is in response to doing policy work and getting our house in order and making sure that the voters are properly empowered, or that we are improperly empowered by the voters. Does anyone else like to say it a different way? Go ahead, Marcia.
I mean, I'm going to say the same thing, but
yes, please.
Spin. So town funding is governed by statute, and the general fund is the money from taxes voted by taxpayers to basically, I think of it as keeping the lights on in town. Once it's voted, the select board has discretion to spend the money in any of those accounts, but each of the accounts has to be spent for what it's been voted. A surplus in the general fund doesn't carry over from year to year. Some things do carry over, like reserve funds, but not the general fund. Previously, the town has kept those funds in what's called an undesignated or unrestricted fund, and the correct vehicle for that is a reserved fund under the statutes. So the reserve fund has to be voted by the voters and only used for the purpose for which it is voted. So Article 7 actually ensures voters that they're going to know that it's in where the general fund surplus is going to go and what it's going to be used for. Now, the board has a choice. It can say, we're going to give this money back to the voters, i.e. ask for less money for the general fund or designate it for some other important use. We took the latter approach to ask the voters to put the money in a reserve fund for emergencies. And we did this primarily because it's clear that we're going to have more climate issues. And this is kind of a savings account reserve fund that will help us hopefully avoid taking loans or reduce the need for loans in the future. So I think Article 7 really helps you understand what's going to happen to your money, and that we're hoping to have something useful to protect us all in the future.
Right. And the only thing other than that, the only other thing that I spoke to is what happens when it's over 16% and what happens when it's under 12%. And if it's over 16% and the board would like to expend its surplus to further the town's goals, we would do it through the mechanism of town meeting, you know, for voters to vote. Okay, thank you, Marcia, for that. I think it really helps for folks to hear like different entry points or different kind of explanations, because I think I really appreciate that. Any other questions? Let me spotlight the people here who, there we go. Okay. Yeah. Well, as I said, if we're not hearing any other questions, and if something comes to you, feel free to write to us at selectboard@norwich.vermont.us. If you would like to hear from town staff, our finance director or our town manager, rather than the board, I'm sure it's a very busy time, but please do write to them. They could answer your questions as well. What else? Any other board members have thoughts? Go ahead, Claudette. What else? What am I miss?
Well, I am just wondering if we want to take this opportunity to respond to some of to a local blogger who where as a public body, if we wanted to respond or if we didn't. But because quite frank, actually, let me just state.
Sure, go ahead.
That some of the information on Chris Katuki's post is inaccurate. The budget does not have anything in it for body cameras. There is funding to replace the dash cameras in the cruisers. The energy coordinator is, we have currently an energy coordinator. This is not a new initiative. It's continuing on with an initiative that we approved for this current fiscal year.
I felt, well, why don't we talk about that a little bit? Because thank you, Claudette, for this. So, why not? I think one of the rationales behind that, and I think we all agreed, was we assumed that there was wide support for an intermunicipal regional energy coordinator. It was previously an article, right? And so if that were to pass and, affect the tax rate, we should take it on the operating budget and meaningfully budget with it as a consideration. So it was a choice that we made. We budgeted for it differently, but it was always there.
Correct. Same thing with the cruisers. We have always set money aside for police department cruisers. We did not vote to purchase a cruiser last year, but the board did vote to purchase a cruiser for fiscal year 23. So there's really nothing new in there. The part-time zoning administrator is just, one could agree that is a new initiative, although we have a zoning administrator. It's just been wrapped up with the planning director. And based on workload, we have opted to fund a part-time zoning administrator separately. So I could agree that is probably could be argued a new initiative. And the drop in the DPW budget, it's multifactorial. We did not have the benefit of a DPW director to help to review the budget. And as Rod had mentioned earlier, we were looking at just completing some projects that we know are out there and not embracing at this point, without the benefit of a DPW director, any new initiatives. And those are the pieces that that were in my head in that blog post that I wanted to address. I think there were a few others that I can't recall, truthfully.
Yeah. Thank you, Claudia. I mean, I think too, like, look, like our department heads are getting a cell phone stipend, right? That's new, but it's, 400 and it's one of these things where if you were to look at like the percentages in the budget, right, you see like big increases, but then if you look at the amount, it's relatively small. I think it was in response to a $40 cell phone stipend for department heads is in response to the fact that people are increasingly working on the go and at home. And it seemed not a problem to make that an offering. So I suppose that is new, but insignificant. Rod, do you want to say anything that you would like to discuss? I liked your economist pointing out that economists would say that we'd effectively decrease the budget because inflation is what, 7% right now, but we don't have to talk about that. Go ahead, Rod. Do you have any comment?
I don't need to talk about that right now.
Yes.
So what I want to point out about the phone stipend versus the current circumstances. So currently, key staff are provided with town phones on a town account. So I want to be very clear and string that out. That means the piece of equipment, the phone, is the property of the town. And the account that supports that phone and makes that phone useful are also an expense to the town. This transition will take away those phones. So the old town manager's phone will go away. The old DPW director's phone will go away, as will those accounts. So there's a net savings in some area. Well, there's a savings in some areas, and there's an additional expense associated with the finance director, for instance, coming on board with their own phone and then being given a $40 a month stipend to support their use of their personal phone for town business. So it's a really different HR solution, if you like, to ensuring that we've got effectively 24/7 contact amongst key staff. So that's some DPW staff, the police chief, myself, the finance director, and Bree Swenson, the director, and other key personnel. So on balance, it's not going to cost us. I think it's going to be pretty lineable with what we're currently spending, but we'll have actually more people using their phones more of the time. I would want to acknowledge at this point that actually trying to use a cell phone, for instance, inside Tracy Hall is an adventure that makes you feel that you're in 1995, but that's a different story for a different day. Most of us use our phones to communicate with each other repeatedly and extensively all day long. And in the case of senior staff, such as the finance director, that includes, realistically, it's a 7-day-a-week proposition. So that's what the stipend reflects.
I want to, Claudia, if I may, just add a little bit more clarity to your comment on dashboard cameras. It is possible. I believe it's using the existing funding, the existing line for that was dashboard cams for the possibility of body cams, but our discussions divided the cost between operating and then also an equipment designated fund for police because we recognized that there was still considerable more policy considerations that were coming down from the state, and that also that we wanted to do due diligence on. And so it was, it wasn't a new expenditure, but it is meeting a need in a different way. And it was separated out to ensure continued dialogue and policy work. So I don't know if that's more precise, but it's certainly not using a new line item or an additional cost. Right. Just because. All right. So I think that was really, I think think that was helpful. You know, it was, there are things that were discussed in that slight, in the slight increase that we were proposing for folks. Any other questions? It was like a little fishbowl. We sort of talked as fishes, and you all heard us, but hopefully that was helpful. Okay, I'm not seeing any. I'm not seeing any more comments. All right. If there's no further comments, we'll move to the final item on, oh, wait, someone says, thank you, Nan. Thank you for all your service and for your extra meetings in advance of the vote. Yes, we recognize that it's a unique and challenging year, and we wanted to do our best. And if anyone had any other questions or comments, like please feel free to get in touch. It's nice that we have one more meeting. All right, well, if there's no further questions, or here, I can turn off the weird comments that just go to me. Now we can talk to everyone. All right, so moving on to adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn.
Okay, Rob, is there a second?
Second.
Okay, seconded by Marcia. In the discussion phase, I'll linger to see if there's any last minute questions from the people. All right, in that case, all in favor, please raise your hand. All right, thanks so much. Happy Town Meeting Day 2022.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Record